Lady Macbeth. She's one of Shakespeare's most memorable and well-known characters, despite only appearing in 9 of the 28 scenes in his play Macbeth. Now, why is this? Why is she so memorable? Well, I think it's because she's so complex. Some people might see her simply as a bitch, a manipulative schemer, a seductive temptress, or perhaps some people see her simply as a loving and dedicated wife. Now, it's this nuance that we're going to jump into today, because the character Lady Macbeth, she comes from a clearly established well of literary characterizations. By this, we mean that she's a bit of a mix of some intriguing inspirations from Shakespeare, and there's more than one way of interpreting her. So stick around today, because we're going to learn a little bit more about what inspired Shakespeare from the real world, as well as some of the more obvious and perhaps less obvious interpretations of this incredible character. So let's jump in. In Emma King's fantastic thesis, she says that Lady Macbeth is a searingly vivid example of a literary tradition that stretches across and through millennia. The archetype and myth of the rageful, vengeful woman. Shakespeare breathed life into Lady Macbeth, but she herself is the result of intertextual classical reception, a pastiche of ideas, traits, and ideologies, explosively crammed into a powerful, wonderfully manipulative, and effective queen. What does this mean? Well, Shakespeare interpolated and often directly integrated Greek and Roman myth into his characters, either deliberately or subconsciously. You might have heard this term interpolation in music before, and it means that we take a melody or parts of a melody from a previously recorded song and we put it into a new song, but it's not a sample. A cool example of this recently would be Charli XCX's song Speed Drive from the Barbie soundtrack. Now, in this song, it's not a direct sample, but she interpolates parts of Tony Basil's song Mickey and Robin's song Cobra Style. So in this same way, let's think of it this way, that Shakespeare actually drew from lots of different sources and inspirations to create this brilliant new character of Lady Macbeth. For instance, Lady Macbeth was inspired by the real Macbeth's wife, Gruach, I think that's pronounced Gruach, of Scotland, who lived in the 11th century. So you might have already known that Macbeth was actually a real king. So Shakespeare used a book called Holinshed's Chronicles, which was a large and comprehensive description of British history, which was blended with some history plus some legend, and he used that as a source to write Macbeth. Now, the Chronicles portrayed Gruach as a powerful and ambitious woman, which Shakespeare amplified in his creation of Lady Macbeth. Now, let's also, in terms of our interpolation, we could call it our hell broth that becomes Lady Macbeth. Let's sprinkle in also some references to Medea and Medusa, and we can start to see how Lady Macbeth reflects the full spectrum of complex mythological gendering positioned in an early modern context that sentences her to die. Think for a moment about Medea, a prominent figure in Greek mythology known for her sorcery and vengeful actions, including, killing her children. Now, Seneca's Medea was translated and published in London in 1581, and it's likely that Shakespeare would have been familiar with it. Now, just like Lady Macbeth, Medea also invokes evil spirits as she prepares to murder her and Jason's children, referencing her womb, breast, gall, and indeed also bloody hands. Medea suggestively unsexes herself, exiling all foolish female fear. Now, King says that both women regard femininity as incompatible with their bloody plots and call on supernatural forces to help them overcome any lingering mercy in their souls. Cool. Now, another reference that you might not have been aware of before was a little reference to Medusa in the play. Now, in Greek mythology, Medusa was also called a Gorgo or a Gorgon, which was one of three Gorgons, meaning three monstrous sisters. Now, in Greek mythology, a Gorgon is a fearsome female creature, most famously represented by Medusa, who you might have seen before as having snakes for hair and having the ability to turn anyone who looks at her into stone. Pretty cool. Now, we see a reference to her. Now, you might not have caught this before. We see a reference to her when Macduff discovers Duncan's corpse and reacts viscerally, crying out, "Horror, horror, horror! Tongue nor heart cannot conceive nor name thee." And he tells those around him to approach the chamber and destroy your sight with a new Gorgon. Now, transformed by death into the likeness of Medusa, the king's unseen body induces a sense of limitless and uncontained horror. Lady Macbeth enters immediately thereafter, her appearance rhetorically framed as the Medusa, a visual reference of Macduff's kind of whirling horror. In other words, Macduff's reference to Medusa operates as a means to announce Lady Macbeth's arrival. And because the audience can't see Duncan's body and the word Gorgon kind of like hangs in the air for a few moments, Lady Macbeth's arrival, as she walks in, kind of conflates in our imagination the image of this classical female monster with her. Pretty cool, pretty cool. So clever. Now let's throw into the cauldron some real-life context regarding Queen Elizabeth I. Now, Macbeth is a play abounding in terms such as man and manliness. In fact, the word man appears 90 times in the play. And throughout the play, manliness is equated with power and the ability to kill. So even though a sole female sovereign, Queen Elizabeth I, ruled England for 44 years, the Elizabethan era was nonetheless a time when women were portrayed to be weaker than men. Thus, Macbeth is a play that mediates on the political anxieties that come with having a female authority on the throne, yet at the same time being a climate in which women were to be seen but not heard. Now, when Lady Macbeth desires in her famous soliloquy to be unsexed, these words reveal the assumed discordance between feminine nature and political ambition, and this reflects the political gender tensions that were already existent in the Elizabethan world. Now, Carla Spivak suggests that Lady Macbeth's "Unsex Me Here" soliloquy can in some ways be read as a kind of grotesque reworking of Queen Elizabeth's Tilbury speech to her troops in 1588 as the Spanish Armada threatened invasion. Both speeches reveal a discordance between feminine nature and political ambition. Now, in this famous speech, Queen Elizabeth rocks up on a huge white warhorse, side saddle of course, wearing silver armour, and gives an incredibly rousing speech to the troops. It's not that Shakespeare set out to rewrite the Tilbury speech per se, rather that Lady Macbeth, her speech, reflects what the Tilbury image had by 1604 become, an image of a female ruler who claimed legitimacy and power partly through the confluence of the weak and feeble body of a woman and the heart and stomach of a king. So let's take a look at some of those different interpretations I mentioned at the start of the video, starting with possibly the most common interpretation of Lady Macbeth, and that is that she's a witch. Hey, look, some people call her the fourth witch, and you know what? It's kind of fair if you look at some of the evidence. So the most well-known evaluation of calling Lady Macbeth a witch came from the German writer Goethe, who labelled her, quote, a super witch. Super witch, she's super freaky. Okay, so this is not surprising because a lot of the lines in the play kind of do give witch energy. Look, at least it implies that she is open to the supernatural and willing to invite it in. We know that critics have sometimes called her the fourth witch. She's encouraging evil deeds, and as I said, she's open to this kind of evil supernatural power. We see that in her soliloquy when she literally says, "Come, you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts." Now, in this soliloquy, she also asks them to make thick my blood. Now, it's important to recognize that this kind of behavior is really the antithesis of aristocratic behavior from women, absolutely. But another important point here is this reference to making thick my blood. In my research, I found out that in the early modern period, we know people, of course, believed in witches, but also there was a belief that witches' blood was so thick with old age and so lacking in fire that it was impossible to extract it. So that thickening of blood to Elizabethan audiences would have no doubt been a little bit of a hint of, okay, she's certainly evil, and it would be fair in that moment to think you're giving witch. If you do a little bit more reading into this interpretation, you'll likely come to the conclusion that she's not, in my view, completely the fourth witch, but Shakespeare includes enough witch vibes there, I think, to keep it completely entertaining for a Jacobean audience, and at the very least to completely characterize her as being very, very wicked. Next, we have the interpretation of Lady Macbeth as the anti-mother. Giving birth in early modern Europe was a dangerous rite of passage, one which most women would go through and some would actually not survive. Besides the promise of pain, the possibility of either both or one of the mother or the baby not surviving could be really, really daunting, which made some expected mothers write that to their unborn children in case they were never able to meet them. So women were largely defined by their domestic roles as wives and mothers, and in the play, the persistent infanticide motifs represent Lady Macbeth as the ultimate anti-mother. Each time Lady Macbeth mentions motherhood, she does it in a perverse way. For instance, she mentions milk 3 times in the play, but each time it's perverse or wrong. For instance, she wishes that her milk, the very thing that feeds her baby, would turn to gall instead of the milk of human kindness. And she vows that she would have slaughtered her milking babe. Not only would she dash in the baby's brain, but she would go further to stop the means of procreation altogether when she calls upon those spirits to essentially stop her menstrual cycle in the unsex me phrase. Specifically, she wishes that her genital tract should be blocked by, quote, thickened blood. And because the womb was thought to be connected to the heart, this blockage will also impede that flow of remorse from her heart. So by having her menstrual cycle stop, Lady Macbeth hopes to stop any feelings of sensitivity and caring that is associated with femininity or with motherhood. Now, Chamberlain argues that the negative images of Lady Macbeth as a mother figure actually reflect controversies concerning the image of motherhood in early modern England. Now, in early modern England, mothers were often blamed when their efforts to heal, comfort, or otherwise care for people failed, and their use of folk remedies, rituals, or unorthodox religious practices were seen as evidence of causing harm and indeed sometimes leading to accusations of witchcraft. So Lady Macbeth then personifies in this play all mothers of early England who were condemned for that fantasy of infanticide. So Chamberlain argues that Lady Macbeth's fantasy is not so much struggling to be a man, but rather struggling with the condemnation of being a bad mother that was so common during the time. We know that early modern accusations of infanticide were used to try and execute mothers and midwives during this time. And this kind of perverse representation of motherhood is sprinkled in another part of the play too, in the witches' ingredients for the cauldron. Think about it, they reference a sow that hath eaten her 9 farrow, which actually sometimes pigs do in fact kill either one or all of their litter of piglets. It's called savaging, I think. Really gross, but true, and certainly perverse and discomforting. And think about another ingredient in the cauldron is the finger of a birth-strangled babe, ditch delivered by a drab. And in this context, a drab meaning a prostitute, or we might say sex worker nowadays. So again, this idea of dead children, dead babies being discarded of, but don't forget as well the historical context there, that illegitimate children were of course considered a sin. There was really severe punishments for any woman who discarded of a child, and of course there was a high rate of child deaths in birth for the mother, as we know, as well as the baby. So let's also consider here that if Lady Macbeth is the anti-mother, then who might be Mother of the Year? You got that right. It's of course Lady Macduff. So in the play, Shakespeare really characterises Lady Macduff as a foil, so really like the opposite of Lady Macbeth, to highlight those differences. Let's think about it. She's a loving mother, she's a loyal wife, and she has had success in her birth journey in that she's got multiple children. So this contrast highlights Lady Macbeth as an anti-maternal and certainly non-conformist female character. So you could read Lady Macbeth as the anti-mother, but have you ever stopped to consider that she might also be a mourning mother? So the writer Wingett suggests that in vilifying Lady Macbeth, critics have failed to appropriately sympathise with her in light of her tragic loss. They suggest that her powerful maternal love for her child and the loss of that child would have been devastating and could have potentially led to the madness that drives the plot. Consider that there is evidence that the Macbeths did lose a child, or she did lose a child before meeting Macbeth. We'll never know. She says the line, "I have given suck and know how tender 'tis to love the babe that milks me." Now, some critics have suggested that the grief over their lost child could have been the motive behind the Macbeth's murderous desires. And Shakespeare deliberately uses language connected to midwifery to connect with the audience on the widely relatable topic of child loss. Think about it. This was a time in which 1/3 of young people died before the age of 15. And as I said before, where childbirth was so dangerous that many women actually wrote their will before they went into labour. Now, Lady Macbeth's sentiment in this line is far from villainous when you think about it. It shows that she loved not only the baby, but that maternal bond that comes from feeding her child. So instead of reading Lady Macbeth's hysterical fits in Act 5 as a representation of a guilty conscience after the regicide, Wingett proposes Shakespeare describes Lady Macbeth as suffering from melancholy and hysteria, equivalent modern day terms for, say, anxiety and depression, beginning in Act 1 before any murders have actually been committed through in the play. So the play explores the fine line between hallucinatory fantasy and ordinary subjectivity, as well as the difficulty of diagnosing mental diseases. Now, in the whole play, but especially in Lady Macbeth's descent into madness and somnambulism, there is a theme of vision affected by corrupted imagination. Many of the sights in the play can be interpreted as illusions of a melancholic imagination or tricks of the eye. Think about it, the vanishing women, the dagger, the ghost, the moving forest, the procession of kings conjured up from the cauldron by the witches. The characters continue to question whether these are true apparitions or products of their own troubled state of mind. Note that in Jacobean England, sleepwalking, or I used that word before, somnambulism, was often attributed to supernatural causes or linked to mental disorders, rather than being interpreted as we might now call a sleep disorder. So while Lady Macbeth's criminal actions can't be totally excused because of her sickness, understanding her struggles with grief and her mental health can actually help us see Lady Macbeth as less of a villain. Our next interpretation is Lady Macbeth as the schemer. So part of this schema reading of Lady Macbeth is, of course, the allusion to Eve from the Bible, because both characters act as a temptress who leads their husband into sin, ultimately causing the downfall. And I can see how she could be considered a schemer when she says things like that she'll chastise with the valour of her tongue all that impedes him from the golden round. It does imply that she will seek to use her spiritual strength, indeed even her sexuality, to steer him to become king. Another notable allusion to the Bible, of course, is in her famous quote, "Look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it," reflecting her wicked, plotting nature. Of course, the serpent is an incredible symbol that you could analyse in your writing when you're talking about symbolism and the characterisation of these two characters. Of course, the serpent being the ultimate evil. So even though when we come down to the murder plan, even though she says, put this night's great business into my dispatch, and I love this line, leave all the rest to me. Let's take it back and pause for a sec to remember that despite her calculated planning, this entire hot mess is still ultimately due to Macbeth's ambition. Think about it. She says, art not without ambition, but without the illness should attend it. Lady Macbeth knows him really, really well, and she knows what he desires, but she does worry about his indecisive character. So what does a good Jacobean wife do? Why, of course, she encourages him and inspires him in his pursuit of this goal. Thus, her love for him and her zeal are misinterpreted as simply enticing and manipulating and scheming, when in actual fact, you look at her actions and you could actually read it as her just being a dedicated and obedient Jacobean wife. She loves him dearly, and hey, she wants his dreams to happen. Well, at least his horrible imaginings. Remember, a married couple at the time are regarded by law as a single entity, and this entity needed to follow the will of the husband. So look, I'll leave it up to you. Is she really a schemer, or is she just a loving and supportive wife? So let's also look at another reading of Lady Macbeth as a vulnerable wife. So this is a fresh perspective that before I read this brilliant article, I actually hadn't really considered. Now, most of us have interpreted Lady Macbeth's vulnerability as being a result of the guilt from regicide. But if we look really closely, her vulnerability is evident really early in the play. For instance, on the night of the regicide, she says, "That which hath made them drunk hath made me bold." Okay, she's straight up telling us that even though she's not going to be the one to kill Duncan, she is still afraid enough to need to get drunk to have a little bit of courage. It's given her a boldness to drink alcohol. Here we can even see that she is actually kind of timid without the alcohol. She even says that had he not resembled her father, she would have actually done the regicide herself. Now, just like with her violent baby brain bashing line, it's possible that she doesn't actually mean what she says when she talks of violence in this way, and that in some ways she's actually just trying to hype her hubby. Of course, the other characters also view her as quite timid and vulnerable too. This is not surprising, it is a patriarchal society. When she asks what's happened after the murder, so it's the morning after everybody's discovering that Duncan's been killed, Macduff says to her, "'Tis not for you to hear," presuming the murder is too horrible for a woman's ear. Okay, not for her, I can tell you. So her madness is also in the play. It can be attributed to an inherent vulnerability. While at first advising Macbeth not to think about the crime, she creeps step by step into insanity, sleepwalking and hallucinating. And you could argue that without vulnerability, she would not be able to feel such a level of guilt and anguish as an outcome of the regicide. Lady Macbeth as an unsophisticated lady. So let's take a look at this. Cheng argues that Lady Macbeth, when you think about it, is actually not all that sophisticated. This in turn leads to her lack of foresight politically, as well as her haphazard and simple plan to kill Duncan. Cheng says this flawed plan contradicts her portrayal as a schemer. She doesn't really think through the fact that Duncan actually has two successors, and the idea to blame the drunken chamberlains borders on ridiculous. Note here too that Macbeth doesn't actually consult Lady Macbeth about killing the chamberlains, or Banquo, or Macduff and his whole family, showing early signs of what you could call a very lopsided and unequal marriage. On the topic of a lopsided marriage, let's look at Lady Macbeth as a patriarchal woman. Now, some hail Lady Macbeth as a pioneer of feminism, but Cheng points out that her mind is deeply rooted in the patriarchal rather than feminist consciousness. Lady Macbeth's first lines in the play do not consist of her own words, but remember it's her husband's as she reads that letter. And this signals that her character's primary motivations are invested completely towards her husband. Then let's think about her name. What was her name again? Lady Macbeth, yeah, but what's her first name? Oh, she does not have one, that's right. It is simply Lady Macbeth. Now this shows that she is defined by her role as Macbeth's wife and her relationship with him within a patriarchal society. She is a subordinate part of him and does not have that independent personality. In fact, in Freud's psychoanalytical interpretation, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth can be seen as representing different aspects of a single, unified psyche. Pretty cool, huh? So Freud viewed them as two parts of a whole, with Lady Macbeth initially embodying the id and Macbeth representing the superego. But why would a vulnerable and unsophisticated woman participate in regicide? Let's call it a kind of blind worship, which reflects her patriarchal consciousness. So this is a character who is deeply influenced by the norms made by men, and for her, Macbeth is dominant. It therefore becomes her instinct to submit to his rule. Let's also look at their lopsided marriage that I mentioned and her lack of a squad, aka any other female friends. Maybe then we might sympathize with her a little bit more. Simone de Beauvoir states that without having any separate identity, a woman is riveted into a lopsided relationship with man. He is the one and she the other. In the play, Lady Macbeth as a female is undoubtedly the other. Their affection for each other is grossly unequal when we really look at this. Think about it. While she's willing to exert cruelty onto herself by unsexing herself to fulfill his ambition, meanwhile, Macbeth only thinks of himself. When Duncan's murder is discovered, he totally forgets his wife. Do you remember she actually faints? And it's then that Banquo and Macduff both show concern for her, not Macbeth. Believe it, if you search in the play, look for the phrase, "Look to the lady." And it is never Macbeth actually looking to the lady to check on her well-being. Note here also that while her fainting could be read as the act of a calculated and manipulative actress in a bid to draw the attention away from the regicide, look, I get it, it does look pretty sus. It's also not a surprising result given that she is grieving a lost child, she has summoned evil forces, she's just found out that hubby has murdered 3 people instead of 1, she's struggling to wear a mask of a good and proper lady in front of powerful guests. It's a lot, and actually I can't blame her actually for fainting. I think I would faint too if I had all of that on my plate. But does Macbeth care? No, he doesn't. His indifference is obvious when later in the play she's succumbing to guilt and illness, and her somnambulism is terrifyingly observed by a physician and her gentlewoman. Now, when the doctor approaches Macbeth to give him an update on her health, he talks extensively to Seton about the war, before finally asking, "How does your patient, doctor?" So he talks war, before he finally says, "How is my wife?" Which is really indicative of that lopsided relationship. Lastly, Lady Macbeth's devotion to her marriage places her in a position of complete isolation in the patriarchal world. Her only close relationship is with Macbeth throughout the play. Think about this entire play. Who are her other female companions? I don't actually count her gentlewoman because she is barely communicating with her because of that state of sleepwalking. And by then, Lady Macbeth's already lost her mind. So when Macbeth orders the murder of when Macbeth orders the murder of the Macduff family, Lady Macbeth sadly loses her only opportunity for someone who could have been a female companion. And Cheng suggests that this lack of relationships with other women is what actually accelerates her tragic end. But there is a little bit of hope. We see that Lady Macbeth, in the end, does actually try to revolt against the patriarchy. So in her famous sleepwalking scene, she washes her hands over and over as her hands are covered in this, obviously blood in her hallucination. And you can read this as evidence that she does feel guilt for her role in the regicide and that it was her patriarchal consciousness that got her involved with it in the first place. So the action of washing hands indicates her remorse for what she's done, and it also symbolizes her inner denial of the patriarchy. Fearing the darkness now, at this point in the play, we know that she carries a light by her continually. 'Tis her command. She's now at the mercy of the murdering ministers that she naively set to control and invite in her earlier soliloquy at the beginning of the play. Now, the fact also here that when she is sleepwalking, if you look closely at the play, she's actually writing letters in her sleep, which could symbolize her desire to release her guilty feelings and to talk with somebody about what she's going through. But she has no one to talk to. Her husband is no comfort to her, and she has no female friends, which makes her small resistance end in death. Emma King writes, "The transgressive force of Lady Macbeth's unconfined and destabilizing gender performance, linked so powerfully to concepts of masculinity, maternalism, and classical archetypes of rage, necessitates her doom. So provocatively resistant to prescriptive structures in life, in death, she joins an ancient canon of rageful women, confined, neutered, and silenced." Now, it's for this reason that I think we will be continuing to study this brilliant character for a long time yet. So I hope this video today has given you a bit more insight into this phenomenal character. If you'd like to access my notes and my sources, click the link below and leave me a comment if this video has been useful to you. I'd love to know, what do you like most about Lady Macbeth? What fascinates you the most about her? So please click like, give me a comment down below, share it with anybody who you think might benefit from it in their Shakespeare studies. And good luck with your work out there. And keep reading, keep being awesome, because that's what literature is about.